And we're live with our 157th episode of Absolute Apsec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another year of Absolute Apsec, but another year of pandemic or endemic or whatever you want to call it now. I'm super excited to be back though. We took a few weeks off, and it does feel like a while since Ken and I caught up, and we interacted with the community. Right, I was starting to feel a little bit isolated, so happy to be back at it. There's quite a bit for us to cover today. There's all sorts of stuff that's happened in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I think we beat the log4 hell or log4j stuff to death right before we left for the break. And we still haven't done our After Dark episode, volume 2.
Yes.
But other than that, we do still have KernelCon on the calendar. We'll be teaching there. They've been tweeting out about it. Our course, Secure Code Review, Practical Secure Code Review, Seth and Ken's Excellent Adventure, whatever you want to call it. We will be teaching how to perform secure code reviews at KernelCon. Hopefully in person, since that's what we're planning on. End of March. Outside of that, I don't necessarily have anything else on the calendar. I know we're big proponents of CactusCon down in Phoenix. Yeah, we've been to that multiple times. I know they're doing, it's February 4th and 5th. Sadly, I can't make it this year. It's right over, family stuff that I've got. I'll post it up there too. Oh, wrong place.
So this is in February?
Yeah, it's February 4th and 5th. And they're running a hybrid at CactusCon as well. I think they're going to have some people on site. I know they're not doing trainings on site. Those will all be virtual. That was one of the reasons we decided we weren't going to do the trainings. We're tired of virtual trainings, but that's just our personal preference. Andrew's running that. I know he's been chatting about it in different channels, trying to decide how to keep people safe and how to keep people happy, which is definitely not an easy thing, right? Everybody's got their own opinion on and their own risk profile, as they should. So
I actually might try to fly down for that. I'm looking at tickets right now.
Really?
Down. Yeah. At this point, I'm like ready to travel again. So I'm just looking at tickets now. So maybe I'll go down there because as you know, I have family down there too. And I think they're, it's been a while. So I'm going to look at tickets, see if I can make it out there. It looks pretty sweet. Yeah. Tickets look pretty cheap too. So I don't know, man. Maybe next episode I'll be like, book tickets and ready to go out there. So
go for it. Yeah. CactusCon is great, right? Like that's one of those small local conferences I love going to. Really vibrant community down there in Phoenix. I know we have listeners that are down there, but a lot of people that I've met over the years are down in that area, and the security community is great down there. So if you can go, or if you just want to participate virtually, go for it as well.
Yeah, dude, I think I'm actually going to look at these ticket prices. I think I might actually just be like, I'm going to reach out to Andrew and just be like, hey, I'm thinking about going out there just to say hi and stuff. So yeah. Cool. I'm glad you said something because I actually didn't realize, because, normally it's in September. So I didn't know it was in February. And honestly, like if you looked out the window here, you would see still we have snow melting, and I'm sure it's similarly not warm where you're at.
No, it's not. No.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it got up into the, the 30s, so I'm feeling pretty good.
That's awesome. Into the 30s. Wow. To be clear, since we have viewers everywhere, Fahrenheit. He's talking about
Fahrenheit. Yes. 30s Fahrenheit.
I guess it would be pretty rough if it was. Yeah.
If it was 30 Celsius, I'd be a little scared for.
Yeah, exactly.
Climate change. Yeah, this time.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. One of the first things, though, I wanted to talk about this episode, Ken, and I know we kind of left it up in the air last time around, but I did want your feeling on predictions for 2022. And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, um,
Oh
but
yeah. No.
yeah, we talked about, hey, what do we expect for the new year, right? I know it was late in December. We were trying to sum up what App won, but at this point, that's too far in the past. So who cares, right? Outside of Log4j, no one can remember anything, anyways. So, what do you expect for 2022 in Apsec?
Well, this is actually on the spot question, but I do have like, because it all, yeah, I have like a few things I think. For one, I think we're for sure going to see more focus on like package ecosystems. I think we're going to see more focus on whether it's securing that or making it something that's a bit more resilient against some of the things which I know we're going to talk about, which is super timely, right? We
Yeah.
just had another package related event occur. So I think there's going to be definitely some focus on how do we make that more resilient. I think there's more to come in the negative, you know, from a negative perspective. I think there's been a lot of activity around NPM, but I would imagine this is going to extend into some other package ecosystems. So that's like one prediction. I think there's basically more to come there from both a negative and positive perspective. I think the other thing is I focus on a refocus, at least for myself, for the team I work with, a refocused effort on. All right, we've been doing testing a certain way for a long time, and maybe it's time to change sort of the way we do our testing. And I think like one of the articles that you had brought up actually will kind of play into that. And I talked about it for like one of those lightning talks that gosh, what's the lightning talks we just did?
That was
DevSec.
yeah, that was
DevSecCon, is that the
Sneaks.
one?
DevSec. I don't know. That was Sneaks, right? Yeah.
Sneaks, yeah,
DevSec.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in that, I talked about sort of where I see testing
Yeah.
falling down these days, and where you could pick back up, right? And you've got something we're going to talk about, which is like how different libraries parse URLs. But I think this is like during that talk, I talk a lot about how we're using a multitude of libraries, and we're using a service-oriented architecture in most cases these days. So you've got multiple web apps, and I've talked about it on the podcast too, where you have communication flowing. Requests flowing through multiple services, being parsed by different libraries in different ways, context shifting between the front end and the back end. Maybe it's a full-fledged service, a microservice, whatever it might be. And so the data basically not being the integrity of what you're looking at not being really having any integrity, if that makes any sense. So it's causing mismatches in authorization. It leads to other flaws. We've got like web cache poisoning. We've got a couple other issues I've talked about. I'm sorry, I'm a little brain dead today, but in any case, I think testing is going to need to change to be a little bit more focused on, all right, what categories of vulnerabilities given what's the risk of what we're looking at? How is it architected? Based off of that, what's our testing methodology? We should be looking at, a certain category of vulnerabilities a certain way, other categories of vulnerabilities a different way. So I think that's going to be something that evolves, at least for myself, my team, and probably others this next year. That's the second prediction. The third is we're going to see more stuff in general around Web3 and just the idea of NFTs, and whether that's going to be from a positive or negative standpoint, I don't know, but I know we're just going to see more of that, which is then going to lead to more interesting research in the Web3 sphere. So in any case, those are my predictions. What are your predictions?
So if you had asked me in November of last year, I wouldn't have said this, but more focus on logging. Woohoo!
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know. I don't know if that's necessarily a from a positive perspective, though. I'll be honest, because the exploit with Log4j and this injection of user content into logs into the logging mechanism won't necessarily change how developers view logging, right? I know documentation is always difficult. I know logging is always difficult, and it's very much based on functionality of an application and actually pushing that application out and what's actually needed, and usually it's just developer stuff behind the scenes. So I think the focus on logging is going to be very short-lived and probably not in the direction that we really want it to go from a security perspective. So on top of that, and package repositories was going to be my other one, right? Like all of the supply chain attacks, we're not going to see that disappear. That's just going to continue to escalate, just like you were talking about. That was number 2 on my list, just because it is. It's such a problem. Like I've been doing a lot of research into client side malware recently, right? Some of the projects that I'm working on. And one of the things that I see application after application is the inclusion of multiple libraries that do the same thing. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later today, but for a simple example, go load, some generic, it doesn't matter, right? But if you look at the libraries that are loaded from, say, online banking, you'll typically see 2 to 3 different versions of jQuery being loaded on any given application that you use, which is so problematic from a developer perspective, but also from a security perspective. I don't think that's been fully exploited, but I see huge gaps there in this inclusion of multiple different or of the same library in multiple different iterations. That's going to cause collisions. It's going to cause unintended consequences, and that has not been fully explored. I know that happens all the time on the front end, but what we're seeing, and this one article we're going to get to, we keep hitting at, right? It's talking about it on the back end as well. Anytime that we overload functions, that we're not quite sure what's being loaded into our application, whether that is from package repositories, whether that's from just the package list that's being loaded or dynamically loaded, it's going to cause issues at some point. So that's my number 2. My number 3, I have a hard time with this, right? I think probably the caching stuff is where I'd go after that, is the increased exposure of caching vulnerabilities, the complexity of, I know you're talking Web3, but the complexity of microservices, and I know it's been out there for a long time, but the complexity of microservices and Nginx and all of the different technologies that we have that exist to actually interact with these web applications introduces caching issues. And it's a problem that is so hard to solve from a computer science perspective that there's always going to be security issues that pop up when it comes to caching. So I think that's focused. Those would be my 3 that I'm looking at from a strict, all right, I want to see where it goes. But I also, am doing some research into it. So
Yeah, I think it's interesting, going back to your first prediction, that you might be right with
I'm
with
pessimistic,
logging
right? Yeah.
getting worse. Yeah, doing it more poorly.
Yeah. Because I mean, you look at what happened with Log4j, right? Okay, there's a vulnerability in an open source project, but what is the initial reaction that most people have? It's okay, we either upgrade or we rip that out, right?
Right.
And so there's going to be this backlash on logging to developers and what technologies they're using. And even though Log4j, like the later iterations, are safe now, there'll be more focus on those vulnerabilities. And we've seen it happen in the past, right? Where we'll stop using it as the proper mechanism, I guess. I don't know.
I could
Maybe
see
I'm wrong.
Well, I could see two other things happening too. One is more of a reliance on external logging external logging services and the libraries they give you to do that external logging, which is, it's like many things, but it's definitely a trade-off, and it's not a trade-off I'm always very comfortable with, depending on what content you're sending out there, right? Performance is one thing, but certainly things accidentally get logged that really shouldn't be. And then when you're doing that to a third-party provider, it changes the nature of things a little bit, right? Also, I could see it being a thing where like less user input is being stored as a precaution. Possibly, I don't know, but that would be another way I could see things going sideways, or maybe even introducing or over complicating how content's being sanitized and reshaped and parsed from users before being placed into logs, and then that being done in a problematic way, or who knows, right? Whenever you get into territories where people overreact and have a knee-jerk reaction, things don't tend to go so well. So I have a gut feeling that and nothing more, that you're probably right when it comes to auditing getting potentially a little worse, at least temporarily.
Yeah, I mean the organizations that were good at auditing will remain good at auditing, because they've got it figured out. They've got that process. They'll switch over to using or they'll continue to use Log4j, or switch to Logstash or one of the others, and they may pull a new provider. But I really think it hurts that mid to small size business that's already struggling, because their reaction is going to be, okay, we're just going to use system.out.println, right, instead. And yeah.
Yeah. And then you're left with, and like I said, I mean, I could definitely see it going the opposite direction of where we would want it to go. I would hope that there would be a focus on improving auditing, but not necessarily omitting it or switching to worse alternatives. So I guess there's probably room for another prediction, which is, given what we've seen, and now that we're talking through it, maybe more of a focus on legacy. Like, think about struts and think about Log4j. When those vulnerabilities occurred, those vulnerabilities have been sitting in the code bases for
20 years. Wow.
Or it being a configuration. Yeah. I mean, it's been around for a while, right? But like, the other problem though with something like that, when you go to fix it, is these things are out of date. Like, they haven't been updated for a reason. Like, these apps are dependent on something that, like, they're afraid to upgrade and deal with the ramifications of things breaking, right? So to me, it's widespread. It's been there for a bit. And to upgrade means serious pain points. Also, you have to know where you need to upgrade, which in larger enterprises is a whole other ball of wax. So I could see more of a focus from the research community on sort of like what you and I might consider legacy technologies, but are very much still in use.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I mean, along those lines, right? Like, somebody actually found that JNDI, and I don't even know if this was Log4j related, right? But JNDI is being used by H2, right? The Java SQL database, offering the in-memory one that we've always found. Yeah, the one that you can find, that you can go and do Google Dorks for, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Let me see. I'll post that one up here too, because that was within the last few days, right? It's on the jfrog.com blog.
Seth and I used to mess around and just like look for
connected people's databases, right? Yeah. Is it? Yeah.
Ethically, but
ethically.
Yeah, Shodan will allow you to find examples of things for your research.
Well, and this isn't super surprising either, now that I think about it, because H2, when you want to connect to a database, allows you to input a JNDI string to get to it, right? Like, it's one of the accepted schema formats for connecting. So I'm like, wow, that was just somebody connected the dots there and figured it out. So yeah. Anyway, that was a fun one to actually look at and to hear about, just because we've seen it before. But again, it goes back to that legacy tech, exactly what you're saying. I mean, I know I talk about my early times in, security, working at a bank, and, all the old tech that they have in place that they were trying to, convert to quote unquote open systems, as they called them back then, right? Which is basically anything that wasn't mainframe. But that was 20 years ago at this point, and I would be surprised if all of those technologies have kept that upgrade path going in most large organizations. Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 50 companies, they're very risk adverse, and that includes upgrading to the latest and greatest technology. It's not just security risk that they're worried about; it's business risk over everything. And you've got an application in there that's a cash cow that you could upgrade it, but if it takes down the business for 2 days, means you lose millions or billions of dollars. Guess what they're going to choose to do? They're going to keep that sucker in place until they absolutely have to do an upgrade to it.
Yeah, plus it's just a thing of some companies don't really want to address technical, or they want to, in theory, address technical debt. But when it comes down to actual, like you said, money, that's time is money, right? You're whenever we do a job, we're leasing our time for money. That's our trade-off. So you're in that case, you've got developers, they're working on a project, their time is your money. And you maybe don't want to spend it on technical debt. Instead, you want to meet some new feature that is going to help, for the next quarter, raise your shares, or whatever thing. Businesses have different things they prioritize in terms of future facing new features, new services, whatever. But very rarely is it, let's take a step back and go address technical debt. I'll say I've been lucky at GitHub. They have definitely taken whole months off to, not months off, but months to focus on addressing technical debt. But that's a rare thing. Most companies don't do that. They don't take huge swaths of time out to address technical debt.
No. Yeah.
Which is what this is, right?
Yep. Yep. I always go back to, penetration testers are just poor QA testers, right? And it's tongue in cheek, but it's true from a business perspective that the vulnerabilities that we find are really just bugs. They're security bugs, yes, and they can have very specific implications to the business and to security. But from a business risk perspective, it gets tied in with everything else that's being done. And to your point, right? It may or may not get solved just based on the business appetite to deal with technical debt. And I deal with this on a daily basis when we're proposing assessments to clients, because I'm very aware of how much it costs for us to do an assessment. And certain organizations will balk very quickly if I come in and say, hey, that 2 million lines of code that you want us to look at, that's going to take me 3 months to do. And it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I know that they're the business size is that the appetite for that sort of expenditure is just not there, even though it could find vulnerabilities and we could eliminate risks for them, or at least point them out to be solved. It's still not within their wheelhouse or not within their appetite to actually spend that much to secure. And I get it, right? Having been on the business side, I get it. I know that there's not, you can't spend $100 to secure $1 asset, right? So there's a certain level of risk that we live with. And I think that's what most even consumers don't understand about these security risks that are out there. Most sites that you go to, they have vulnerabilities, right? I wouldn't even argue most sites. Any site that you go to has vulnerabilities that they've accepted as the risk of doing business.
Yeah, for sure. That's always the tough thing, especially when when you're when you're first coming in, when you're like less experienced, that's a hard thing to reconcile. Actually, in that book that's over my left shoulder, Tribe of Hackers, I talk about that in the book. I'm like, sometimes you have to realize it just comes down to straight up, that's the business decision, and you have to learn to accept it. Change the things you can, accept the things you can't, move forward in life and career. And that's an unfortunate reality that we all deal with. Although I do want to get to this "Don't Mix URL Parsers" article, because the more I read it, by the way, since you shared it with me, the more I'm like, oh man, this is exactly what I was talking about in those predictions, and then in that talk for, again, I think it was DevSecCon or something like that.
DevSecCon
talk.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is okay. Let's just get into it. I'm going to post it here and then put it in general as well, of absolute AppSec. But yeah, do you want to give people a brief summary on this one? But man, I'm excited to talk about this.
So Daniel, I know I've run into his blog a couple of times in the past, right? But he does analysis on his adventures of URL parsers and their differences. And I think that's where it started, right? Is he started to look at the different URL parsers that are out there, how they actually parse URLs, and what the differences in them are, and then why you shouldn't be using multiple different libraries to parse URLs in the same application, right? And it all goes back to security principles and redirects and just the way that you understand how a library works, popping in one library for another one, or using something like curl on the back end as opposed to just a get or a URL.schema. I can't even remember the different libraries he looks at right now, but it can cause problems.
Real briefly, you said inside of the same application, but that was my point. That was my point, is that we're not doing this parsing in just one application. This is the point of what this is what they discuss, but that is my point, is that the parsing doesn't occur in just one place. It could happen in 4 places by the time it reaches like wherever the sink is, right? The last place that's going to be parsed and then interacted with. But anyway, sorry. So just to set the tone, there's don't use multiple libraries for parsing in the same app, but also like be very wary if you're using different libraries with multiple applications. But anyways,
I love that as the sum up on the article, right? My URL isn't your URL. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, and to be completely honest with you, Ken, like I skimmed this article and thought, wow, this is great. But I haven't dug into it probably even as much as you have so far. Right.
It's super interesting. I mean, I want to read this book, the Exploiting URL Parsers, the Good, Bad, and Inconsistent, which actually, let me find the link to that. I'm immediately fascinated in all of this because, man, this is what I've been trying to say. There's an increasing amount of confusion between apps when you get into a service-oriented architecture, which is just about everything. Even if you don't think you're service-oriented, you probably are. Like if you just like, I don't know, you use the most basic Elastic Beanstalk functionality, we'll say, on AWS. Well, now you've got like probably a front-end load balancer to handle your traffic. Maybe that's doing some application layer stuff. You've got some different services you're connecting to, very likely inside of AWS, if your app is doing anything with a database or doing anything with like an in-memory database, or if it's doing anything with anything other than just like rendering static content, which in that case is probably you're not using AWS, right? You're probably using something much simpler than that. Nobody wants to run their own servers like for something super static and simple. So even when you think that it's not, anyways, even when you think you're not a service-oriented architecture, you might be. So, this is only growing in like this direction for architecture. But then we're seeing like, for instance, they reference Orange Size, a new era of SSRF. And if you've seen this podcast, you've seen Seth and I talk about the orange size, like 4 chained vulnerabilities on GitHub, but it came down to like, it usually comes down to anyways, like parsing, right? You think URL parsing is like one of the hardest things to get right. It really is. It's actually terribly hard, depending on what you're trying to do, of course. But man, I'm not prepared for the depth I want to go into with this. But it ranges from everything with confusion of what a URI versus a URL is, right? URI being a resource that could be an SMTP server, it could be FTP. The protocols and schemas range wildly there, so that the standards for parsing are not what you think. If you're like, well, I'm going to parse this URL, I'm going to get a host, I'm going to get a path, the schema, blah blah blah, that should be good, and I'm going to put them maybe back together and form a URL. Great. But then you start getting into weird territories where it's like, even if you're doing just URL parsing correctly, there's other things that can go wrong. For example, I think one of the things Orange Sai had shown was using like hex instead of just like a domain name or IP. Used something like hex, I think. But it was interpreted as like a valid location for a server, and sure enough, like SSRF, right? The request goes through with user supplied input. We've seen all kinds of like weird ways to get around strict parsing just because the server, the server itself, as well as the libraries that it's using, are doing things in unexpected ways. And I just think this problem is going to keep continuing to grow out of control if we don't rein certain things in. One thing I've talked about recently internally is having a front end that does, we know exactly like how, and I'm trying to keep it abstract enough to not like give specifics away, but imagine like you could parse the data using known good libraries, using known good functions within those libraries. And so repeatable data that we can feel pretty confident about. And then just sort of rehashing that, giving it some integrity, having integrity checks on that data, and then passing that around throughout your service-oriented architecture. That's one way that I see maybe getting ahead of something like this. But this isn't the only problem that we have, right? That's just SSRF and URL parsing. There are so many other libraries that we're using that can cause just the confusion itself can lead to security vulnerabilities, which is like in the first few paragraphs they talk. It says like, if you I'm going to just verbatim, if you parse a URL with, and you can just take URL out of the picture and just imagine data, right? If you parse a URL with parser A and make conclusions about the URL based on that, and then pass the exact same URL to parser B, and it draws different conclusions and properties from that, it opens up not only for strange behaviors, but in some cases for downright security vulnerabilities. And that is my prediction for this year. We're going to see more of that, because you can, like I said, replace URL with data, and you can say like, yeah, system A drawing conclusions from data versus system B drawing conclusions from that data, and then both of them trying to make some logic related decisions on that. Man, personally speaking, I've had to stay up nights because of this type of behavior. So anyways, whatever. I could go on and on and on, but I need to read this book, man. This looks really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I pulled it up. I posted it there too. That the actual upload, the paper from all those different guys. That it was interesting. There like 5 different categories of inconsistencies that they found, but all of the different parsing libraries that they looked at, right? And these are the guys. It looks like they're from Sneak, but it's also the research from Daniel, who is the creator of curl, right? That's where it actually started from. But yeah, like URL lib, URL lib 3. I mean, you look at all the different parsing libraries that are just available within Python or Java, and then start to think about the parsing that happens in different applications, like whether it's from Chrome, like how it does parsing versus Safari or web application or mobile applications when they parse something. And you can see where this just it expounds as you start to think about the differences that are associated with each of those libraries.
They even show like Log4j Man, this is such, oh dude, I want to read this whole PDF. Like I'm dying to read this
Yeah.
PDF. This is so cool. But like they even talk about some of the remedies for JNDI not working because of weird parsing issues. So soon after the fix, a bypass for that was found, and it allowed remote JNDI lookup and allowed the vulnerability to be exploited to get our RCE again because of parsing mismatches. Like this is what I'm talking about, man. This is only getting harder for us. And going back to the testing part of that, my point with the testing was that like I see two primary ways that are the most efficient to detect this stuff until we have like a large data set of what libraries have what behavior. Static out in my mind is the least efficient way. That sounds probably for coming from you and me specific, that does not sound like something I would normally say, but absolutely I think that's the case here. So unit testing, I think, is probably one way to, but when I say unit testing, I mean unit testing with like a fuzzing, a real fuzzing sort of approach there, but also like dynamic testing and fuzzing in that way. Those are the only ways I see some of these things being quickly and efficiently detected. I don't think that static, like I said, until we have a larger data set of like known oddities with libraries and the way they handle and exchange data, it's going to be runtime testing, which is basically all I'm saying with unit testing and dynamic analysis, just runtime testing, just fuzzing really in the runtime.
Well, and I mean, that goes back to all, old things are new again, right?
I know. I thought it before you said it.
Because I talked about this, 2014, 2015 with Sputter, right? Like actually like, the fuzzing ability and dynamic testing. Like we really like digging into source code, but we can only go so far, right? And I'm very limited. Like we're very limited from a static analysis perspective on what we look at. It's very custom to the application, to the source code base. So I'm not getting into these differences with URL schemas, right? Unless I know there's a vulnerability, like that first article we looked at, I know they dived into JNDI as well there. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, man. Like, I would hope that people are doing that sort of fuzzing. And I know, me and Stefan especially have talked about it quite a bit. And it's just I'm with you, right? Like, I don't think that we catch these from a static perspective, I guess is where I'm going with that.
I just, I think it'd be too, I mean, one thing you could find with static analysis is like, you could get a collection of the libraries that are being used and then say, well, service A versus service B versus service C. But that's just an indicator of a potential smell. It doesn't mean anything for like actual detection. I just, going back to like what, when we had James Kettle on the podcast, and I encourage anybody listening to go check that episode out. James has some pretty good thoughts there. But when he talked about like, hey, I just modified my payload and tested thousands of sites in 15 minutes using my framework. Like, dude, I can't do that with static analysis. I can't like test an assumption that quickly on thousands of sites with static analysis. So, anyways, I definitely see testing getting into this weird thing now where it's like you really do need to pare down on what things you're going to test for using what methodology. So it's just, I think for us, it's getting more complicated is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this goes back to why we built out the methodology for secure code review, right? Was having this like prioritized list of items that we can look at for source code. But I feel like we get away from that when we're doing dynamic testing, right? I know we do prioritization there, but there's a lot of, hey, and I know there's a lot of client expectations when I talk to them about like what a dynamic application security assessment is, that they assume that we're looking at every single endpoint, that we're looking at, we're running all of these fuzz tests. And we definitely do that from an automated perspective when we're using something like Burp. but that doesn't mean that we necessarily go to the level, like we're always time constrained. We're always going to be time constrained when it comes to those assessments. We're never going to be able to get full coverage, which is why I ask the question, what is most important to you, right? Because that's where I want to spend my time as a tester coming into it. And I think that's, it would behoove us to actually document that process as well, Ken. We've done it for secure code review, but it may be worth it to do it for dynamic assessments and start pulling out some of these fuzz tools and documenting, hey, guess what? This one works really well if we were looking at an API that is using some strange Nginx configuration, and we're going to actually fuzz that because we can do that fairly easily. And that's what's most important, as opposed to, hey, we're looking for SQL injection everywhere and it's a modern framework, so it's probably not the most important thing that we need to focus on right here. Right? So
yeah.
Dude,
the more I read this article, the more I'm like, yes, because they're talking about, oh my gosh, when you get down to like the blacklisted URL section where they're showing code examples of like checking against blacklisted URLs, and if it's in that array of blacklisted URLs, then it doesn't get an exception. Otherwise, you proceed forward. And then they talk about how when the data is put back together, things get appended, and then there's a bypass for that check because it's looking for localhost. It's not looking for HTTP localhost, but because of the parsing and HTTP being added back in. I mean, this is what I've seen. Like, this is what you've seen, like over and over again in our career. URL parsing is probably one of the hardest things to get right at times, depending on what you're doing with the data, of course. I mean, that depends on what kind of checks, for sure. I think it's cool too. They did Node. They did Node. They did the browsers. They did Ruby. Did Laugh. They did Perl as well. They checked Perl as well. So that was pretty just kind of funny to me.
Hey,
but anyways, dude, like this is a crazy good read. It's 33 pages. It's not that long. I feel like I've skimmed most of it anyways. We'll
dig into it and maybe reprise it next week, right? Like the stuff that we've identified, because that's it's very, the fact that they use the log4shell vulnerability right at the beginning to actually dig into it shows why it's such an issue. So it's very kind of prescient, or however you want to say it. It's very relevant right now to what's going on in the industry. So take a look at it when you get some time.
Do you want to talk about shifting gears? Do you want to talk about the NPM thing?
Oh, yes, we should. We did have that comment asking about what should one know before getting into Apsec. That's a longer conversation.
So I'm actually putting together, I have a note literally right in front of me, right there on my my desk I'm working on a path to mastery for Apsec for our own there's folks that are interested in just getting basically for work. There's some folks that are interested in, the path to like, what is the path in Apsec? And I thought a lot about the fact that it's not really somewhere I found, it's not something I found documented that necessarily follows like that I agree with. I want to make something personally that I think will get you to that path to mastery. And so maybe I take what I do for work and then work with you, Seth, to create
let's post it. We'll post a page on AppSec.com. Let there stand. Maybe we'll do an episode on it as well when we do it at that same time, because it's a question that we get quite often. Right. I know there's OWASP and all that sort of stuff that's available, OWASP.org, but it doesn't necessarily have that kind of lined out. These are the things that we expect someone to know when they're getting into Apsec. I think that's where, Ken, you're going. And I feel like there wasn't a path when I came into it, so I stumbled into it. It'll be on absoluteapsec.com when we get it all the way solidified. But we'll talk about it. Yeah, and we'll tweet.
Yeah, and we'll tweet it. We'll put it on our Absolute Apsec Slack. Like we'll definitely you'll just keep an eye on any of the ways that you get updated absolute AppSec stuff, you'll see it for sure. Because this has been something that's come up quite a bit as a question. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, just sort of like, and I've gone back and forth on certain aspects of it, for sure. Like,
and I'm sure we'll argue about it, right?
I'm
Certain
sure
aspects, right? You know, just
debate
based
it,
on
yeah.
where we're at and where you're at in your career, it kind of differs. But the base level is definitely there. And I know, like, I get asked this all the time, just personally, and I know you do too, Ken, right?
Yeah.
As you're going around talking to college students and others that are interested in the fields. Yeah, it'd be a good resource to have. So
And
thanks for the
more.
Yeah.
And we do need more. We do need more people in this field. It's
Yep.
Everything we do is powered by software these days, and there's not as many of us as nearly enough of us for the need that's out there. As you can see by Seth and I's faces, we're getting older. No offense, Seth, but we're getting older, and I think it's something I think a lot about, is like the next generation, we'll say, of folks coming up. So,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about. Let's see, which one did we want to jump into here? Now I forgot again.
So for this, and I was going to say, for this NPM thing, I have to
NPM,
put out a couple
yes.
things. For one, there are going to be some things I can't talk about because I was literally on the call with the folks that are dealing with this from NPM side this morning. So there will be things I know that I have to shy away from saying. Also, the little disclaimer: yes, I work for GitHub. They own NPM. Well, technically, I work for GitHub, who's owned by Microsoft, who also owns NPM. So, but anyways, so yeah, I have to put that little disclaimer out there. So yeah, there will be some things that are, so everything that I talk about is my personal opinion. It's not going to be from a work related perspective. Yeah, those are kind of the setting that up. But if you want to go into like, do you want to like tell people a little bit about, what happened?
Yeah. So basically, I just posted the article. I think there's multiples that talk about it, but basically, a developer who produces both like a couple different popular NPM libraries decided that he wasn't getting paid enough and pushed out a version that did weird stuff. Like, and it's still, the library still worked, but it started to print out gibberish messages to the console. And let's see, it was the colors and faker projects that are used by millions of projects are dependent upon these, right? And if you go look at that article, you'll see that it does there's just a mischievous commit, right? It wasn't anything super malicious, but it did introduce an infinite loop, right? It almost felt a lot like the hacktivism stuff that we saw years ago, where people would take over, they would deface a website, for whatever purpose that they had behind it. But in this case, it was just, they bumped the version, so it was automatically pulled by all the different repositories and rebuilt in the CI/CD pipelines. And then, basically it goes back to him, last year or a year and a half ago, posting about how he shouldn't necessarily, like he wasn't going to support big companies anymore, right, with his open source work. And like he wanted to be paid is really what it boiled down to. So I don't know, from a strict like security perspective, people that weren't pinned to specific versions of colors and faker.js were seeing their CI/CD pipelines basically blow up and enter that infinite loop, and then all these console messages that were being spammed over and over to the console, filling up logs, doing other kind of malicious things, even though the applications continued to work. So in response, since the projects were hosted at GitHub and NPM is a portion of Microsoft, they rolled back the versions to reintroduce stability on those projects, and they suspended that developer's accounts. So there's been quite a bit of backlash and questioning on whether or not that response was warranted, right? We all trust GitHub. I saw some responses in like Reddit posts and other things that were, oh man, we should never use like, commercial utilities to trust our open source code with, right? Like there's all these hot takes that people have about the situation and what's actually happened. What I always go back to is, yes, but he intentionally abused his users' trust in those applications, right? After running this library for years and years in a specific manner, and decided, hey, now is the time that I'm going to quote unquote cash in, but almost blackmail my users into doing something for me, right? And once you open source a project, that code is no longer yours, right? And this is where I have like, I don't know if it's I'm walking a fine line here, or if it's just my own personal preference or personal opinions. So take it with a grain of salt. But my understanding with open source and how it actually is structured from a legal perspective is, once you open source it, once you apply that GPL or that Apache 2 license to your code base, it is technically owned by the community, and it's no longer your personal private repository or your personal language that you can do whatever you want with. It doesn't mean that you don't still have a version that you can create other instances with and stop supporting, but the code that you've put out there is owned by the community, and wherever you store it, wherever you push it into those repositories, they're going to have consequences, and they're going to have a say about what happens with that code. So I know I wandered around that, Ken, a fair bit, but from a summary perspective, like, what is it that you view as actually have happened?
Yeah. And first of all, like I just agree with everything you've said. And even if you own the access to it, you've written it, it's yours. You have to realize that the community, you've open sourced it. People can have access to it. They can also have access to your updates. If your updates are nefarious like this, you really, open source does run on something you said really resonated with me. Open source is really about trust, right? And breaking that trust can have serious long-term consequences. I hope this is the only person that does this. I hope this isn't a trend that continues, for sure. And again, I just want to reiterate, these are my personal opinions. I won't get into like anything about their accounts or things being locked or all the claims that have been made online. What I will say is that, for a long time, I live near DC, right? So I've had my fair share of exchanges with the government and with various teams working for the government, teams working for large financials, heavily regulated industries. Just so there's a lot of that, right? Whether it's banks, whether it's the government, there's a lot of that around here. I can tell you that it has been a long road for a lot of people to get these institutions to trust open source enough to allow them to write applications that are built on the open source community. It's been a long struggle. One of the biggest, draws to this is that you have a huge collection of tools that can do things sometimes better than you can if you would write it yourself. There's like lots of, I don't want to go into all of them, but there's a lot of pros, a lot of good reasons to use open source, even if you work for a large institution who could, in theory, hire great developers and write, these libraries themselves. So that battle, has been waged, and people ultimately seem to have gotten these institutions to trust open source to a degree. And there's obviously tools like, like Black Duck and Sneak and stuff like that to like, check these libraries for known security vulnerabilities. Certainly GitHub's got some tools for that too. So, but it's still, at the end of the day, a lot of it's based off of trust. So if people go breaking that trust, they're going to undo a lot of hard work by a lot of people. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I think this person truly thought, this was going to be some sort of movement against institutions. But do you think that the CEOs who are sitting on yachts give two shits about your update to this library? No, it's the people that you would be sitting next to at a conference, that you'd be working with out of a cafe. It's the people that you imagine if you had to stand in a room with all the people that you negatively impacted from your decision to do this. What would you think then? If they were all sitting right in front of you, how would that feel? Right? When you put this is people that were hurt by this. This wasn't some company or some institution. This was a lot of people hurt by this. And if people continue to go down that route, there's going to be a lot of undoing in the open source community, a lot of undoing of goodwill in the open source community. So I think what I'm trying to say is this was a very immature action, in my opinion. I can't imagine what was going through this person's mind. I think who they intended to hurt, if that's truly the reason that this was done, is not hurt at all by this. And I think the collateral damage are the only people that are actually hurt by this, which makes them not collateral damage. It makes them the target. So anyways, if you can't tell, I'm frankly a little perturbed about the whole thing. But yeah, let's hope that's not a trend that continues.
Yeah, I don't know. I go back to the days of I date myself pretty quick, right? Like when I came into the industry and how open source was viewed, and exactly what you're saying, right? Like I remember going to my first programming job, and most of the frameworks that we used were not open source frameworks. And how long it took to develop software internal to an organization when you did not have access to a library as extensive as what's available in NPM or even Java libraries nowadays. Like that open source software makes the internet work. So the second that we start to screw around with that base and we break the trust that users have with that software, things go very poorly. And this was always my problem when I went and saw Richard Stallman speak, right? Like years ago, like he did like this huge, I'm touring all across the, all across the country, all across the world, talking about GNU herd and how, we shouldn't be using, Unix utilities, but I should get paid for using the software that I'm developing, and then was really down on Linux because of how it came about. And it was very hard to get organizations to take his software and his utility seriously because of how he presented himself and how rigid he was in his understanding of what software was and how it was to be put out, right? So it came down to even things like bagging on the local computer club for giving away books that a publisher had sent or they had bought at a bookstore to give away as prizes because the books weren't open source, or it wasn't free to give this language or give this out, and it was owned by someone else. And I just part of me is really disappointed with how it went down, right? Like, but mainly because of the decisions that were made up front and the trust that is broken. And then looking at the guys that are running those DevOps pipelines and exactly what you're saying. Okay, how much work did they have to put in to actually perform this? And then I'm glad that NPM stepped up and rolled back that version because of hey, we're going to take a step back. We're going to give you back what was stable, and then we can figure out what's going on from here.
Yeah. I mean, yes, exactly. Like, yes, you can roll back, but it's going to require some work. It's not, yeah, just trust is broken in that case. And we were talking out of bound on Slack, leisure suit Larry. I still love the handle, but Larry was talking about it being difficult to get access to libraries that, now you can just go to GitHub and find, or Bitbucket or wherever you can find libraries that on the internet, open source libraries that do things that you want. And then and that's the thing, is that you have to remember that in order for us to operate, and I think everybody agrees that it's a good thing. I think if we can all mutually agree that it's a good thing that we're more agile in development, and not just in development, but in our infrastructure, that DevOps is a good thing, that Agile is a good thing. If we can all agree upon that, then we also have to agree that there's no way you can operate. You can't operate in those environments or operate in that way without having access to the open source ecosystem. It's just too difficult and too slow and too cost prohibitive and time prohibitive to operate quickly and build cool things and see technology, the speed at which technology is evolving. If you have to go through procurement and, as Larry said, pay through the nose and go through some significant process just to get access to a library that does something. Or alternatively, spend massive amounts of time on development to do something that's, I don't want to like say the word trivial, because that's not, I don't think any open source code is necessarily, I'm not trying to say it's trivial, but I'm saying some of these things are not necessary. There's things you want in your application, but it would be like the cost to develop them versus their usefulness, a bit of a trade-off there, right? So I guess I'm just trying to say, like, if we can all agree that DevOps is a good thing and moving quickly is a good thing, and a good thing from a security perspective, which I would highly argue that's the case, then we have to trust open source maintainers to not go rogue and pull stunts like this.
Yep. Well, I always go back to, if you want to know what it was like 20 some odd years ago to develop software, go pull down like the core Microsoft Windows SDK and try to develop an application without using any third-party libraries, or only paid third-party libraries, because that was the situation that we were in years ago. Before Linux, before Mozilla, before all of these open source utilities and tools came about, you had to build it yourself. And like, from a security perspective, I would be right there with you, because we just know how poorly we do with custom software as it is on a day-to-day basis, even when we're using secure frameworks. Take that and multiply it by 100,000 times when you have to build your own SQL ORM, right?
Oh yeah, God, could you imagine? And also, like, where do you? Because there's another argument for open source, like you said, it's that there are many eyes on one thing, and like an ORM, we can feel like people have the ability from all over the world to look at an ORM and say, oh, there's SQL injection there. Here's my PR to help fix or help mitigate that vulnerability. If it's a closed source ORM, you have the eyes of whoever is willing to look at it. And it's just, I mean, we don't need to rehash it forever, but like, there's so many good arguments for open source when it comes to security. It's like, don't ruin that ecosystem. But anyways, I have other knowledge too that makes me even more annoyed, but I just can't share it. So anyways, I'll say that.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch and see what happens in that space. Just what the response is going to be, both from the open source maintainers and from, the package repositories as well, like how they watch for malicious packages, right? Like, it's not necessarily just malicious, I guess, but also, just hacktivism, like it happens all across the board. So
Yeah.
anyway, so we've been going for over an hour.
Starting off the year with a bang. It's not all gloom and doom, folks. We're excited for this new year.
No, we are. We definitely are. Watch for a post. We're going to finish up our Laravel secure code review. Ken and I just need to sit down and figure out a night that works for us, so we can push that out. It'll probably be within the next week or so. And
just so you know, usually Wednesday nights are good for me.
Okay. Yep. And actually, they are for me too. So maybe we'll do it tomorrow night. Watch watch Twitter, watch the Slack channel, join the conversation. I'll check the website, make sure that the Slack channel invite still works. I'm pretty sure it does. But if it doesn't, let us know. Reach out on Twitter, and we will update. And otherwise, thanks for coming back and spending yet another episode with us in another year. We're excited to get involved. We have some new swag on its way. And so if you would like some of that, start interacting, and we'll send it along. So
thanks, y'all.
Anyway, yep. Thanks, everybody. We'll see everybody at the very least next week.
Yeah, very, very. Oh, we have a guest for next week too. So I'll put some more information in Slack for that. But we have a guest for next week that it should be interesting. So cool.
Sweet. All right.
All right.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.